The morning sun glinted off the Persian Gulf's surface like scattered diamonds as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen settled into her seat aboard the U-60 Black Hawk helicopter. She'd made this journey dozens of times, routine transport from the USS Vanguard to forward operating base Darhan. Routine. That word would haunt her forever. Sarah adjusted her tactical vest and checked her classified intelligence briefcase one final time. Inside lay documents so sensitive that only 3 people in the entire Navy had access to them. She was one of them. Her mind was still processing the implications of what she discovered during her latest reconnaissance mission, anomalies in Iranian naval communications patterns that suggested something big was brewing in the region. Admiral Hartwell would need to know immediately. The helicopter's rotors began their rhythmic thump-thump-thump, a sound so familiar it barely registered anymore. She'd heard it hundreds of times, background noise to her military career. Today, it would become the soundtrack to her nightmare. All clear for departure, the pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, called through the intercom. He was young, maybe 28, with the confident demeanor of someone who'd logged over 1,000 flight hours without incident. "Weather's perfect. Should have you at Darhan in 40 minutes, Commander." Sarah nodded, though Morrison couldn't see her from the cockpit. She glanced at the other 2 passengers. Petty Officer Second Class Michael Torres, a communications specialist, and Hospital Corpsman David Kumar, who was heading to the base for a 3-week rotation. Both seemed relaxed, comfortable. Nobody suspected what was about to happen. The helicopter lifted smoothly into the sky. Sarah watched the naval carrier shrink below them, becoming a gray speck against the vastness of the water. She'd served on that ship for 18 months now, and despite the stress, the constant vigilance required of an intelligence officer, she loved it. The Navy was her family. She joined at 22, right out of the Naval Academy, driven by a need to serve something greater than herself. Her parents had warned her, her mother especially. "It's dangerous," she'd said. "Why not do something safer?" But Sarah had always been drawn to challenge, to purpose, to the knowledge that her work mattered. And it did matter. The intelligence she gathered affected naval operations, strategic decisions, potentially saved lives. That weight of responsibility was something she carried with pride. 40 minutes. That's all she had to live before everything changed. 10 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed something odd. The helicopter's engine note shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but her keen ear caught it. She'd spent enough time around military aircraft to know when something wasn't quite right. She looked up from her briefcase, listening intently. Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, deliberately casual but with an edge of concern. "Tower, this is Black Hawk 6-7. We're experiencing some unusual vibrations in the hydraulic system. Running diagnostics now." Sarah's stomach tightened. She'd heard those words before during training scenarios, but never in actual flight. She unbuckled slightly, leaning forward to look toward the cockpit, though the angle prevented her from seeing anything useful. Torres, sitting across from her, had noticed too. His eyes met hers with the beginning of alarm. Kumar, the corpsman, simply looked confused. He was new to this, probably thinking minor vibrations were normal. 6-7, confirm your hydraulic readings, the tower responded, the operator's voice now crisp with professional concern. There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice returned, and now the edge was unmistakable. "Tower, we're showing pressure drop in the primary hydraulic line. Secondary system is nominal, but primary is dropping fast. We're diverting back to the carrier." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She moved through the mental checklist. Secure classified materials, prepare for emergency procedures, assess evacuation options. But even as her mind cataloged these tasks, fear crept in like cold water. She'd studied helicopter emergencies, everyone in the military had, but theory was vastly different from reality. The helicopter banked sharply, beginning a turn back toward the USS Vanguard. still visible on the horizon but growing smaller as they attempted to return. Sarah gripped her briefcase tightly, her knuckles whitening. "Come on, baby," Morrison whispered, though his voice was audible through the intercom. "Hold together, just hold together." 30 seconds of tense silence followed. Sarah counted them. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. The kind of counting you do when you're trying not to panic. Then everything went wrong. An explosion, not loud but violent. The helicopter lurched sickeningly to the right. Alarms screamed to life simultaneously, a cacophony of electronic horror that cut through the engine noise. Red warning lights blazed across the instrument panels in the cockpit, visible even to Sarah as she craned her neck to see. "Hydraulic line rupture," Morrison shouted, his voice now edged with genuine terror. "Losing pressure, losing pressure." The helicopter's nose pitched downward. Sarah felt her stomach lurch as the sensation of controlled flight transformed into something else, the sickening weightlessness of falling. Kumar gasped audibly. Torres lunged for his safety harness, though he was already secured. "Brace for impact," Morrison's voice screamed through the intercom. "All passengers brace for impact." Sarah moved with instinctive precision honed by 1,000 emergency drills. She secured her briefcase to her body with webbing, positioned herself in the crash position, knees bent, hands protecting her head, and locked her harness down tight. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she thought it might break through. The Persian Gulf rushed up to meet them. She had maybe 5 seconds to think. 5 seconds to process that this was real, that she might die, that all her training and all her preparation might amount to nothing against the brutal mathematics of a falling helicopter. Her parents' faces flashed through her mind. Her best friend from the academy, Jennifer, who'd warned her that helicopter deployments were risky. The life she'd been building, the plans, the dreams, all of it suddenly suspended in the moment before impact. Sarah Chen's last conscious thought before the collision was simple: not like this. The impact was apocalyptic. The helicopter hit the water at an angle, the rotor blades disintegrating on contact with the surface, exploding into twisted metal fragments that scattered across the waves. The fuselage crumpled like aluminum foil, the force of the crash throwing everyone forward violently. Sarah's vision exploded in white light and pain as her head struck the frame of her seat. Salt water rushed in through fractured panels. She was drowning. No, wait, there was air, a pocket of air. Her training reasserted itself through the agony and shock. "Move, get out now." Sarah unbuckled with shaking hands, her vision swimming. Around her, the helicopter's interior was chaos, water pouring in, equipment scattered, oxygen masks dangling uselessly. She could see Kumar struggling with his harness, blood running down his face. Torres was slumped against his seat, unconscious. The main fuselage was sinking. Sarah could feel the angle changing, the helicopter rolling. She had minutes, maybe less, before it went under completely. She grabbed her briefcase instinctively. 18 months of classified intelligence couldn't fall into the water, and pulled herself toward the emergency exit. Her training screamed to get out, to get away from the sinking aircraft. She found the emergency hatch, twisted the release handle with desperate strength, and pulled. The hatch came free. The opening yawned before her like the gateway to survival or death. She couldn't yet know which. Sarah took one last breath of the helicopter's dying air pocket and plunged into the Persian Gulf. The water was shockingly warm but disorienting. She kicked upward, her lungs already burning, her vision tunneling. The briefcase felt heavy, threatening to drag her down, but she refused to let it go. Classified intelligence, national security. These things still mattered, even as she fought for her own survival. Her head broke the surface. She gasped, coughing salt water, filling her lungs with precious air. The helicopter was sinking fast, its tail already underwater, the rotor blades creating a dangerous vortex. She kicked away from it with frantic strokes. Behind her, Torres emerged, gasping and coughing. No sign of Kumar. No sign of Morrison or the co-pilot. "Sarah," Torres choked out. "Sarah, we need." An emergency life raft deployed automatically as the helicopter sank, inflating as it hit the water. Sarah swam toward it with every ounce of strength she possessed. Her uniform was heavy, waterlogged, dragging at her. The briefcase was an anchor, but she refused to surrender either. She reached the raft and pulled herself aboard, her body screaming in protest. Torres was right behind her. They collapsed onto the inflated rubber, gasping, shaking, alive. The helicopter's tail section disappeared below the surface with a sound like the ocean swallowing a grave. Within seconds, there was nothing left but wreckage, scattered debris, and two survivors floating on an endless expanse of water. Sarah turned to look back at Torres, their eyes meeting with the weight of shared trauma. And then she realized, Morrison, Kumar, the co-pilot. She looked around frantically for any sign of them, but the water was empty except for floating debris. Torres shook his head slowly. "I didn't see them get out. I didn't see them." Sarah keyed the emergency radio with shaking hands. Static answered her. She tried again. Nothing but dead air. The radio was waterlogged, non-functional. The backup also submerged during the crash. They were alive, but they were alone. No communication. No way to tell anyone where they were. No way to call for help. Sarah looked at the endless horizon, at the vast emptiness of the Persian Gulf stretching in every direction. Her training, her courage, her resilience, none of it felt like enough for this. The weight of survival suddenly pressed down on her shoulders with crushing force. "What do we do?" Torres asked, his voice small and lost. Sarah took a breath, pushed down the panic threatening to overwhelm her, and activated the survival protocols that would define the next 72 hours of her life. "We survive," she said quietly. "We survive and we wait for rescue." But even as she said it, looking at the vast, indifferent ocean, Sarah wondered if rescue would come before the sun, the thirst, and the crushing loneliness claimed them both. The first night was the hardest. Sarah sat in the life raft beside Torres, watching the sun bleed into the horizon like a dying wound. The warmth that had sustained her through the adrenaline-fueled escape began to fade as darkness swallowed the sky. The temperature dropped with shocking speed. Her uniform, still soaking wet, clung to her body like a second skin of ice. Torres was worse off. He'd hit his head during the crash, and while he remained conscious, he drifted in and out of lucidity. Sarah had fashioned a makeshift bandage from the emergency first aid kit stored in the raft's survival pouch, but his condition worried her deeply. Head injuries were unpredictable. She monitored him constantly, checking his pupils with a small flashlight from the survival kit, asking him simple questions to assess his mental state. "What's your name?" she'd ask. "Michael Torres, Petty Officer Second Class," he'd respond, sometimes clearly, sometimes with confusion. "What year is it?" 2024. "No, wait, is it 2024? The uncertainty in his voice terrified her more than she wanted to admit. The survival kit had yielded modest resources. 2 emergency blankets made of thin, reflective material that provided minimal warmth, a water container holding approximately 1 liter of fresh water, energy bars that tasted like compressed cardboard, a first aid kit, a signaling mirror, a flashlight with failing batteries, and a desalination pump that seemed promising in theory but required manual operation that exhausted her quickly. Sarah rationed everything with military precision, calculating consumption rates against time. She allowed herself and Torres only small sips of water, maybe 10 milliliters every hour. The human body could survive weeks without food, but only days without water in this climate. The Persian Gulf's heat was relentless, even at night, stealing moisture from exposed skin, drying lips until they cracked and bled. By the second hour of darkness, hypothermia became the enemy despite the ambient temperature. The wind picked up, and evaporative cooling on their wet uniforms dropped their body temperatures dangerously. Sarah wrapped both of them in the emergency blankets, pulling Tors close for shared warmth. He mumbled incoherently, his body shaking violently. "Stay with me," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Just stay with me." Sleep came in fragments. Sarah dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes at imagined sounds, rescue helicopters that didn't materialize, ships on the horizon that proved to be nothing but wishful thinking. Her mind played cruel tricks, offering false hope before snatching it away with devastating finality. Around 2 a.m., Tors became delirious. He sat up suddenly, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Where are we?" he demanded. "Where's Morrison? Where's the ship?" "We're in the raft," Sarah said calmly, using the voice she'd learned in officer training, the one designed to calm panicked subordinates. "We're safe. The Navy is searching for us. We just need to stay alert and conserve energy." "I hear voices," Tors said, looking around frantically at the empty ocean. "Do you hear them? They're calling for help." Sarah's heart broke. She pulled him back down gently, wrapping the blanket around him again. "That's the wind, just the wind. Try to rest." But she understood what he was experiencing. The human mind wasn't designed for the absolute emptiness of open ocean. It needed stimulation, needed context, needed the familiar. When denied all of that, it began to invent alternatives. She was experiencing it too, the subtle distortions at the edge of her vision, the sounds that might be engines or might be imagination, the desperate hope that transformed every ripple into a ship's wake. The first dawn came as a blessing and a curse. Light returned to the world, but with it came brutal, unfiltered heat. The sun climbed the eastern sky with indifferent ferocity, beating down on the raft with the intensity of a furnace. Sarah fashioned a shade structure using part of the emergency tarp and the signaling mirror, creating a small pocket of shadow where Tors could rest. But even the shade was stifling. Water became everything. The 1 liter they'd started with seemed impossibly small now. Sarah rationed it with religious devotion, maybe 20 milliliters for each of them per 4-hour period. Enough to keep them alive barely, but never enough to truly quench thirst. The thirst was indescribable. It wasn't just a dry mouth. It was a consuming, all-encompassing need that made her entire body ache. Her lips cracked further, bleeding into the water she drank, mixing blood with fresh water in a macabre cocktail. Her mouth felt lined with leather. Every word became an act of will, every swallow a small agony. The desalination pump became her obsession. The survival instructions promised that it could convert seawater to fresh water, but the process was brutally exhausting. Sarah would pump the handle rhythmically, push, release, for 15 minutes at a time, producing maybe 100 milliliters of dubious fresh water that tasted faintly of salt no matter how carefully she operated the pump. Her shoulders burned. Her forearms ached. But it was something, some small way to fight back against the ocean's attempt to kill her. Tors remained mostly unconscious through the morning. His wound had stopped bleeding, but the bruising around his temple had turned a sickening shade of purple. Sarah checked his pupils periodically. They remained responsive, which was good, but his breathing seemed shallow, concerning. She didn't have medical training. That was Kumar's role, and Kumar was dead. Around noon on that first full day, Sarah heard something that made her heart leap, the distant sound of an engine. She grabbed the signaling mirror with trembling hands and began flashing frantically toward the horizon. Come on," she whispered, her voice raw from disuse and thirst. "Please see us, please." For 10 agonizing minutes she flashed the mirror in methodical patterns, her arms shaking with desperate hope. A ship had to be nearby. Had to be. The Navy would have initiated a search immediately. They would be looking for them. But the sound faded. The horizon remained empty. No ship appeared. Sarah sat down heavily in the bottom of the raft, the mirror falling from her numb fingers. The disappointment was worse than not hearing anything at all. Tors stirred as the day progressed. By mid-afternoon, he regained enough lucidity to sit up and take water. Sarah made him drink, supervising each sip to prevent him from gulping too much too quickly. Rapid rehydration on an empty stomach could cause serious complications. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We crashed around mid-morning yesterday," Sarah replied. "So, about 20 hours. Tors looked at the endless ocean surrounding them, and something in his expression broke. "No one's coming, are they?" "The Navy's searching," Sarah said with forced confidence. "It's a big ocean, it takes time." But doubt gnawed at her. The helicopter's communication systems had failed before she could transmit their position. There was an emergency locator transmitter on the aircraft, but it had been in the cockpit with Morrison and the co-pilot, both almost certainly dead. Did the ELT survive the crash? Was it transmitting? Or were they truly invisible to the world, two ghosts floating on an endless sea? That night, the second night, was worse than the first. The temperature dropped again, and the wind picked up into something approaching a gale. The raft pitched and rolled in ways that nauseated Sarah, her body protesting the constant motion. She secured both herself and the semi-conscious Tors with safety lines, terrified that waves would sweep them overboard. She talked to herself constantly through those dark hours, narrating her actions to maintain her grip on sanity. "I'm checking Tors. His pulse is steady. Good. Temperature's normal. Consciousness improving. That's positive. The water supply is holding. Rationing at current levels, we have maybe 4 more days. Maybe 5 if we're very conservative. The Navy will find us before then. They have to." But she heard the doubt in her own voice. Hallucinations came with the third night. Sarah saw her mother standing at the edge of the raft, looking disappointed. Her mother had always been skeptical of the Navy, and Sarah imagined her saying, "I told you it was dangerous. I told you to do something safer." Sarah argued back, her voice cracking, "It matters, Mom, this matters, I matter." Then her mother was gone, replaced by a destroyer cutting through the night, its lights blazing. Sarah stood up, shouting, waving her arms. "Here, we're here." But as she reached toward the ship, it dissolved like morning mist. She was alone again. By the morning of day 3, Sarah's condition had deteriorated significantly. Her body was sunburned despite her attempts at protection. Her uniform provided some shield, but her face, neck, and hands were crimson and blistered. Moving hurt. The blisters on her palms had worsened from operating the desalination pump, some rupturing into weeping wounds that she wrapped carefully with bandages from the first aid kit. Tors was conscious more often now, but he existed in a strange, dreamlike state. Sometimes he seemed present and aware. Other times he called out for people who weren't there, Morrison, Kumar, people from his family. Sarah let him talk, understanding that delusion provided a kind of mercy. As long as he was lost in his mind, he wasn't fully experiencing the reality of their situation. The water was nearly gone. Sarah had reduced rations to 10 milliliters every 6 hours, just enough to prevent complete dehydration but nothing close to adequate. Her lips felt like paper. Her tongue felt swollen, pressing against the roof of her mouth. Every word required conscious effort. She'd stopped speaking except when absolutely necessary. The desalination pump became harder to operate. Her hands shook. Her strength was failing. One session of pumping left her dizzy and gasping for breath, her heart racing irregularly. She pushed through, knowing that stopping meant accepting death. Around midday, Sarah forced herself to take inventory. The emergency rations were nearly gone. 4 energy bars remained, tasteless but caloric. The water would be finished by tomorrow morning if she kept current consumption. After that, she would have the desalination pump and seawater. She could last maybe another week if luck held, maybe 10 days if she was very disciplined, but rescue needed to come before then. It had to come before then. Sarah looked at the horizon, and for the first time, she allowed herself to genuinely consider the possibility that no one was coming, that no one might ever find them, that the Navy might eventually give up the search, might mark her and Tors as killed in action, might write reports about what had gone wrong with that helicopter, that her parents might attend a memorial service, that her life, her service, her sacrifice might end on an anonymous stretch of the Persian Gulf, witnessed only by an indifferent sky. She wrapped her arms around herself, and for the first time since the crash, Sarah Chen allowed herself to cry. She cried for Morrison and Kumar, for the co-pilot whose name she'd never known. She cried for Tors, deteriorating beside her. She cried for the future that was slipping away with each passing hour. She cried because she was terrified and alone and exhausted and had nowhere left to turn except inward. But even as she cried, some fundamental part of her refused to break. She wiped her eyes, checked Tor's vital signs, secured the raft against the afternoon wind, prepared the evening water ration, maintained her protocols because that's what surviving meant, not giving in to despair, but instead continuing to perform the small, necessary actions that separated life from death. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on her third day at sea, Sarah looked up at the sky and made a simple promise to herself. "I will survive this," she whispered. "Whatever it takes, I will survive." She didn't know if rescue was coming, but she knew she would fight for every breath, every moment, every possibility of survival for as long as her body could continue fighting. She was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen of the United States Navy, and she would not go gently into that dark night. The morning of day 4 began like all the others, with Sarah waking to the sensation of the raft rocking beneath her, the sun's heat already building despite the early hour. Her body was a catalog of suffering. Sunburn had evolved into something worse, her skin blistered and weeping in places. Dehydration had hollowed her cheeks and turned her lips into cracked leather. Her hands trembled constantly from weakness and electrolyte depletion. Tors remained unconscious through most of the night. Sarah had performed her regular vital sign checks, pulse, respiration, pupil response, and found everything marginally stable but declining. The head injury seemed to be stabilizing, which was good. The malnutrition and dehydration were the real killers now. He needed medical attention, real medical attention, not the improvised care she could provide with a basic first aid kit and determination. The water was gone, completely gone. Sarah had finished the last measured ration at dawn, and now she faced the reality she'd been dreading, total dependence on the desalination pump. The process of converting seawater to fresh water was brutally inefficient. She needed to pump for 20 minutes to produce perhaps 150 milliliters of marginally drinkable water. Her hands were bleeding, her shoulders screamed in agony, and the effort left her dangerously exhausted. She forced herself through the morning routine anyway. Secure Tors, check the raft for leaks, scan the horizon, operate the pump, drink sparingly, repeat. The monotony was its own form of torture. Each day blurred into the next. Time lost meaning. Sarah had been tracking the hours by scratching marks into the emergency ration box, but she'd stopped bothering yesterday. What did it matter what day it was? What mattered was that rescue hadn't come, and the ocean continued its indifferent assault on her body and mind. Around 10 a.m., as Sarah sat mechanically pumping water for what felt like the 1,000th time, she heard something that made her freeze. An engine. Not the distant fatting sound that had mocked her on day 1. This was close, real, growing louder. Sarah's heart lurched so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. She dropped the pump and grabbed the signaling mirror with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the horizon frantically. There to the northeast, barely visible against the morning haze, a boat. Not a commercial vessel, not some distant cargo ship. This was a military patrol boat, fast and lean, cutting through the water with purposeful speed. "No, no, no," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. "Please see us, please see us, please see us." She began flashing the mirror with frantic intensity, angling it toward the boat, moving it in deliberate patterns that had been drilled into her during survival training. The reflected sun beam shot across the water like a desperate message written in light. The boat didn't change course. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. She was losing them. They were going to pass by without seeing her, and she would have to face another night in the raft, another day of uncertainty, another slow erosion of hope. "Tours," she screamed, not caring about water conservation or energy preservation. "Tours, wake up." Tours stirred, his eyes fluttering open. What is it?" "There's a boat," Sarah pointed, her hand shaking. "There's a boat." She returned to the mirror, flashing with even more intensity, the beam cutting across the waves. Come on, see us, see us." For 30 agonizing seconds, nothing changed. The boat maintained its course, moving laterally across her field of vision. Then the boat's course shifted, subtly at first, then more dramatically. It was turning toward them. Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, not painfully, but like a dam giving way. Relief flooded through her so completely that her knees buckled. She sank down into the raft, still holding the mirror, still flashing, needing to make absolutely certain they were committed to the intercept. The boat grew larger. She could make out details now, military markings, the silhouette of armed personnel, the distinctive shape of a Navy patrol craft. The engines roared louder as the boat accelerated, covering the remaining distance with impressive speed. "They found us," Tours whispered, wonder in his voice. "They actually found us." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only watch as the boat approached with the inevitability of salvation. The vessel slowed as it drew alongside the raft. Sarah counted 6 personnel on deck, all of them moving with the practiced efficiency of military training. But it was the man who leaned over the rail who captured her attention, massive, muscular, with the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to high-stress situations. He wore the insignia of a chief petty officer. "We have visual on 2 survivors," he called into his radio, his voice steady and professional. Then he looked directly at Sarah, and his expression shifted to something almost gentle. "You're going to be okay now. We're getting you out of there." The chief's name was Marcus Williams, though everyone called him Doc, a nickname earned through 5 deployments as a SEAL Team 6 medic, responsible for keeping some of the most dangerous men in the world alive when bullets and bombs tried their hardest to do the opposite. He was 52 years old, had a wife and 3 kids in Virginia, and had seen enough human suffering to know the signs of someone on the edge of survival. What he saw in Sarah Chen was a woman who'd been pushed to her absolute limit and had somehow managed to keep from going over the edge. "Easy, ma'am," Doc said as his team prepared a rescue line. "We're going to secure you first, then get your friend. Just hold on a little longer." Sarah wanted to laugh at the suggestion that she could fail now, with rescue this close. She'd survived 4 days in an open raft, 4 days of dehydration and hallucination and crushing despair. She could survive whatever came next. The rescue line descended, and Sarah secured it around her waist with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the knots. The team was efficient and professional, hauling her up and over the rail with surprising gentleness. She collapsed onto the deck of the patrol boat, gasping, tears streaming down her sunburned face. Doc was there immediately, kneeling beside her, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he began his assessment. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams. I'm a medical professional and I'm going to help you, okay? I need to check you out." "Tours," Sarah gasped. "Michael Tours, he's injured, head wound." "We'll get him next," Doc assured her, his hands already moving across her body, checking for injuries, assessing her condition with professional thoroughness. "You're severely dehydrated, sunburned, malnourished. When's the last time you had water?" "This morning, maybe 150 milliliters. I was using the pump." Sarah's voice trailed off. The reality of rescue was becoming concrete, and with it came delayed shock. Doc's jaw tightened as he continued his examination. IV bags appeared in his hands almost magically. Someone get a line in her. We need fluids now, and get the corpsman to stand by. We've got another survivor." The IV needle slid into Sarah's vein with practiced efficiency. Doc had done this hundreds of times, in conditions far worse than this. Fluid began flowing into her system, and she felt it almost immediately, a sense of her body beginning to recover, beginning to remember what adequate hydration felt like. "You did good," Doc said, his voice warm but clinical. "You survived. Not everyone would have made it 4 days out there. You should be proud." "Tours," Sarah repeated, unable to focus on anything except her fellow survivor. "We need to get Tours." Tours was conscious when they hauled him aboard, but barely. He was worse off than Sarah. The head injury had worsened, and dehydration had hit him harder. Doc triaged him with the calm competence of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions under fire. IV lines, oxygen, constant monitoring. The team moved around Tours like a choreographed dance, each person knowing their role, executing with precision. "Status," Captain David Reeves, the boat's commander, appeared at Doc's shoulder. "2 survivors, both stable but critical," Doc reported. "Female officer, severe dehydration and sunburn but otherwise intact. Male enlisted, head trauma with possible concussion. Both need hospital-level care immediately." Captain Reeves nodded and moved to the radio. "Tower, this is Patrol 7. We have both survivors from the helicopter crash. 2 patients, both critical but alive. Request immediate medical evacuation to USS Vanguard." The response came almost immediately. "Copy, Patrol 7. Medevac helicopter inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Well done." Sarah felt Doc checking something on her inner wrist, his expression shifting as he examined her more closely. She was too exhausted and dazed to think much about it at first. Relief and hydration, and the simple reality of rescue overwhelmed all other considerations. But when Doc's hand froze, when his jaw tightened, when he exchanged a meaningful look with Captain Reeves, something in his demeanor changed. "Commander Chen," Doc said carefully, "I need to ask you a question. Have you had any medical procedures recently? Any implants or surgeries?" Sarah's exhaustion-fogged mind struggled to process the question. "No, why?" Doc's fingers pressed gently against the small bump he discovered beneath her skin, just above her wrist. It was tiny. Sarah had never noticed it, had never felt it, had never been aware that something foreign was embedded in her body. "Ma'am, I'm finding something unusual, something implanted. Do you have any idea what this might be?" Sarah's blood went cold despite the warmth of the tropical sun. "What are you talking about?" Doc exchanged another look with Captain Reeves. This was no longer a simple rescue. This was something else entirely, something that would spiral into implications that neither Sarah nor anyone else could predict. As the medevac helicopter appeared on the horizon, bringing with it the promise of hospital care and recovery, Sarah felt dread bloom in her chest. Because embedded in her skin, transmitted data through her body, and had been doing so for months without her knowledge or consent, was a device that would change everything. She'd survived the ocean, but the real trial was just beginning. The medevac helicopter descended toward the USS Vanguard's flight deck with practiced precision, its rotors thudding against the humid air. Sarah lay on a stretcher inside the aircraft, an IV drip running into each arm, an oxygen mask covering her face. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt growing dread. Doc Williams sat beside her, his massive frame folded into the cramped space of the helicopter's medical bay. His eyes kept returning to her wrist, to that small, impossible bump beneath her skin that he'd discovered on the patrol boat. He'd said nothing more about it during the helicopter ride, but his silence spoke volumes. She could read the shift in his demeanor, the way his expression had changed from warm rescuer to something more analytical, more suspicious. When they touched down on the carrier's flight deck, a full medical team was waiting. The efficiency was impressive, Sarah and Tors were unloaded, transferred to proper gurneys, rushed toward the carrier's medical bay with practiced speed. But Doc stayed close, still watching her wrist, still saying nothing. The medical bay of the USS Vanguard was a marvel of compact engineering, all stainless steel surfaces and organized efficiency. Sarah was transferred to an examination bed in the trauma suite. A young doctor, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, no relation to the helicopter pilot, began a more thorough examination. Severe dehydration, advanced sunburn, malnutrition, Morrison narrated as his hands moved across her body, checking, assessing, documenting. Mild hypothermia exposure on day 1 based on muscle memory. No apparent internal injuries. Superficial wounds on the hands from what appears to be equipment operation. He paused, nodding her blistered palms. Manual desalination pump, I'm guessing. Sarah nodded weakly. Only way to get water. Morrison smiled with genuine respect. Smart thinking kept you alive. He continued his examination, working methodically down her body. Then he reached her wrist, the same wrist Doc had examined on the patrol boat. He felt the bump and his hand stilled. "What's this?" he asked, not to Sarah but to Doc, who had remained in the bay despite this being outside his normal chain of command. "That's what I wanted to show you," Doc said carefully. "Found it during preliminary assessment. Commander Chen says she has no knowledge of any implants or surgeries." Dr. Morrison's expression shifted to something between concern and confusion. He pressed gently on the bump, feeling its edges, assessing its dimensions. "How long has this been here?" he asked Sarah. "I don't know. I didn't even know it was there until Chief Williams found it. What is it?" Morrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he called over a nurse. "Get radiology. I need x-rays of the left wrist and I want them stat. And someone get Captain Reeves on the phone. I think he needs to know about this." The x-rays took 20 minutes. Sarah lay in the imaging suite, her arm positioned awkwardly while the machine hummed and clicked, capturing images of her skeletal structure and whatever lay embedded within her skin. She felt her anxiety building with each passing minute. The casual professionalism of the initial rescue had transformed into something more urgent, more concerning. When the images came back, Dr. Morrison's face went pale. He studied the x-ray with Doc Williams and Captain Reeves, who had arrived in the medical bay with the grim expression of a man who'd been told something was very wrong. The three of them spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing back at Sarah, their body language screaming that something serious had been discovered. Finally, Captain Reeves approached her bed. He was a lean man in his mid-40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His expression was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that military personnel adopted when delivering bad news. "Commander Chen, we need to ask you some questions," he said, his voice formal and official. Gone was the gentle rescuer tone from the patrol boat. This was military business now, and we need you to answer very carefully and very honestly. Do you understand? Sarah's heart began to race. "Yes, sir." "Have you had any surgeries in the past 2 years? Anything medical at all, even routine procedures?" "No, I had a routine physical when I deployed, but that was it." "Why?" "Has anyone ever mentioned implanting anything under your skin? Any medical personnel, any officers, anyone at all?" "No, sir. What is this about?" Reeves exchanged a glance with Doc. Then he placed the x-ray on a light board so Sarah could see it. There beneath her skin was something unmistakable, a small, metallic device with complex internal structures. It was clearly not biological. It was clearly not supposed to be there. "What the hell is that?" Sarah breathed, staring at the image in disbelief. "That's what we need to figure out," Reeves said quietly. "That device appears to be some kind of transmitter, sophisticated technology, not standard military issue, and according to your account, you have no knowledge of how it got there." The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave. Someone had implanted something in her body without her knowledge or consent. Someone had turned her into something, a carrier, a spy, a walking intelligence asset. Every classified briefing she'd attended, every sensitive mission she'd worked, every strategic conversation she'd been part of, all of it potentially compromised. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would someone do that? How would someone do that?" "Those are excellent questions," Doc said, his voice carrying an undertone of barely controlled anger. "And they're questions that Admiral Hartwell is going to want answered very quickly." The next hours were a blur of interrogation. Admiral James Hartwell, Sarah's commanding officer, arrived in the medical bay with a security escort. He was a stern man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent 40 years navigating the complex waters of military leadership. When he saw the X-ray, his expression crumpled. "This is impossible," he said flatly. "This doesn't happen, not on my watch, not in my intelligence division." But it had happened. Sarah was interrogated repeatedly, gently at first, then with increasing pressure. When had she last been to sick bay? When had she been unconscious? Had anyone ever approached her with a hypodermic needle? Had anyone ever treated her for an injury that she might not fully remember? Was there any medical personnel she didn't trust? Any moment when she'd been sedated or knocked unconscious? The questioning went in circles because Sarah had no answers. As far as she knew, she'd never been implanted with anything. But clearly she had been. Clearly, someone had done something to her without her knowledge or consent, turning her body into a vessel for espionage. Dr. Morrison conducted a more comprehensive examination, attempting to determine the device's function and capabilities. Using a sophisticated scanner, he was able to determine that the device was indeed a transmitter, probably GPS and data transmission combined. It had been broadcasting her location and possibly intercepting her communications for. The doctors couldn't be certain. The device's battery appeared to be long-lasting, suggesting it could have been active for months, possibly longer. Based on the scarring pattern and the device's integration with her tissues, Morrison explained to Reeves and Admiral Hartwell, "I'd estimate this implant has been in place for at least 12 to 18 months, possibly longer." 18 months. Sarah's entire deployment, her entire tenure in naval intelligence, her entire access to classified information, all of it potentially compromised. Doc Williams remained her constant presence through the interrogations. He brought her water and encouraged her to hydrate further. He brought her food and watched her eat, ensuring she was recovering properly. And between the official questions, he asked his own. "Who do you trust?" Doc asked during one of the breaks, his voice low so that the security personnel outside the medical bay couldn't hear. "I don't know anymore," Sarah replied, her voice hollow. "How do you know who to trust when someone you trusted enough to be near while unconscious did this to you?" "We'll figure it out," Doc promised. "Whoever did this is going to answer for it. That's a promise I'm making to you personally." By evening, Sarah had been cleared medically for limited movement. Torres remained under observation. His head injury was more serious, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. But Sarah was strong enough to move around the medical bay with assistance. Admiral Hartwell returned late in the evening with additional personnel. Sarah recognized one of them, Captain Marcus Holloway, the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his mid-50s, with the kind of easy charisma that made people trust him instinctively. He'd been part of her briefing team when she deployed. "Sarah," Holloway said warmly, approaching her bed, "thank God you're alive, we thought. When the helicopter went down, we feared the worst. This business with the implant is deeply troubling, but we'll get to the bottom of it." Something in his tone set off alarms in Sarah's mind. It was too smooth, too practiced, too rehearsed. She found herself studying his face more carefully, looking for tells, looking for signs of deception. "Thank you, sir," she said carefully, her tone guarded. "The investigation is going to be thorough," Holloway continued. "We'll examine your entire service record, Interview everyone you've come into contact with. Review all medical personnel who might have had access to you. This is clearly some kind of isolated incident, but we need to ensure nothing like this happens again. After he left, Doc pulled a chair close to Sarah's bed. His expression was troubled. "What?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Doc said slowly, "but something about that conversation felt wrong. Did it feel wrong to you?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, but I can't articulate why. He seemed genuine, but your gut was screaming danger," Doc finished. "Trust that instinct. In my experience, when something feels wrong, it usually is. And right now, everything about this situation is wrong. Someone implanted a sophisticated surveillance device in your body. That someone had access to you while you were vulnerable. That someone had the medical knowledge and resources to do it successfully. That's not a random act. That's targeted. That's personal." Sarah felt cold despite the warmth of the medical bay. "You think someone in the Navy did this deliberately?" "I think," Doc said carefully, "that we need to be very cautious about who we trust with what we know, because whoever did this is still out there, and they know you survived the helicopter crash. They might not appreciate that." The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but absolutely clear. Sarah had survived the ocean's attempt to kill her, but the true danger, she was beginning to realize, might come from within the institution she dedicated her life to serving. The investigation began in earnest the next morning. Admiral Hartwell established a secure war room deep within the USS Vanguard's intelligence section. Only 7 people had clearance to access the investigation: Hartwell himself, Captain Reeves, Dr. Morrison, Doc Williams. Granted temporary access due to his role in the discovery, Sarah, a military lawyer, and a counterintelligence specialist named Captain Jennifer Walsh. Walsh was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and the demeanor of someone who'd spent her entire career rooting out secrets. She'd handled espionage cases before, serious ones. Her presence signaled that Admiral Hartwell was taking this with absolute seriousness. The first thing Walsh did was secure Sarah's service record and begin a chronological reconstruction of her movements over the past 18 months. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing duty logs, medical visits, classified briefings, and personnel movements. "Walk me through your deployment," Walsh said, sitting across from Sarah in the secure briefing room. "I need to know every place you've been, every person you've interacted with, every moment you might have been vulnerable to medical intervention." Sarah spent hours recounting her deployment. She remembered the initial physical examination when she'd arrived on the Vanguard, routine blood work, standard vaccinations, height and weight measurements. She remembered dental work a month in. She remembered a minor injury, a cut on her hand from equipment that she'd had treated in sick bay. Walsh documented everything, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "The timing is interesting," Walsh observed. "Your dental work was 11 months into your deployment. That's a period when you'd be sedated, unconscious, unable to monitor what medical personnel were doing to you." "You think it happened then?" Sarah asked, her stomach churning. "I think it's a possibility we need to explore," Walsh replied carefully. "Who performed your dental work?" "I don't remember. It was routine, just a cleaning and filling." Walsh made a note. "We'll investigate every dental personnel who was on this ship during that period, but I want to ask you something important. Has anything seemed unusual? Any gaps in your memory? Any moments where you felt strange or disoriented? Any reactions to medical treatments that seemed odd?" Sarah thought back, searching her memory. "No, nothing obvious, but I wouldn't necessarily notice, would I? If someone was good enough to implant a device without my knowledge, they'd be good enough to cover their tracks." "Exactly," Walsh said. "Which means this wasn't done by an amateur. Whoever did this has serious medical training and access to sophisticated surgical equipment. That narrows the field significantly." Over the next 2 days, the investigation expanded dramatically. Military intelligence specialists began analyzing the device itself. It was, they determined, a sophisticated dual-system transmitter, GPS for location tracking, and a data intercept module for capturing classified communications. The technology was advanced enough to suggest significant resources and expertise. More disturbing, the device was fully operational and had been broadcasting Sarah's location continuously, which meant whoever had implanted it knew exactly where she was at all times. Whoever had implanted it knew her position when the helicopter crashed. Whoever had implanted it potentially knew she'd survived. This was no accident, Doc said grimly when he reviewed the technical analysis with Sarah. Someone wanted to track you. Someone wanted access to your communications. Someone was using you. The investigation into other personnel began. Walsh had the ship's medical records pulled, not just for the past 18 months, but for the past 3 years. She began cross-referencing every person who'd had access to Sarah with every person who'd have the medical knowledge to implant a sophisticated device. The list was longer than expected. Ship's doctors, nurses, corpsmen, surgeons brought on board for specialized procedures, visiting medical personnel from shore-based facilities. Dozens of possibilities, hundreds of intersections. But then the pattern emerged. A junior doctor named Captain Marcus Holloway, no relation to the deputy director, though Sarah found that suspicious in itself, had been present for multiple critical moments. He'd supervised her initial physical. He'd been present at the dental procedure. He'd treated her when she'd cut her hand. He'd even examined her once when she'd complained of minor stomach trouble. "We need to question him," Walsh said, but when she went to find him, the young captain was gone. He'd requested emergency leave 3 days earlier, coincidentally, just hours after Sarah and Torres had been rescued. Where was his emergency leave destination? Hartwell demanded. The answer came back: Bahrain. From there, flight records showed he'd boarded a civilian aircraft heading to Dubai. From Dubai, his trail went cold. "He ran," Walsh said flatly. "The moment he learned the device had been discovered, he ran." But the investigation didn't stop with the junior doctor. Walsh and her team began examining the circumstances more carefully. Why would a young naval officer risk his career, his freedom, his future by implanting a surveillance device in a fellow officer? There had to be motivation. There had to be someone directing him. The answer came from an unexpected direction. A signals intelligence specialist named Petty Officer First Class David Kumar, no relation to the corpsman who died in the helicopter crash, though Sarah was beginning to wonder if coincidences still existed, came forward with information. He'd been reviewing communications logs and had noticed something unusual: encrypted messages being sent from the ship to external recipients, transmitted through what appeared to be sanitized communications channels. "The security protocols should have caught this," Kumar explained to Walsh in the secure briefing room, "but whoever set up the encryption knew exactly how our systems worked. They knew the backdoors. They knew the security gaps. This was someone with deep knowledge of our communications infrastructure." The messages had been sent approximately twice per week. The content couldn't be fully decrypted, but the patterns and timing suggested they were intelligence reports, and the recipients, based on the routing, appeared to be foreign intelligence agencies. Someone was selling classified information. Someone was using Sarah as a source. Someone on this ship, in a position of authority and trust, was committing treason. The investigation expanded exponentially. Now it wasn't just about finding who implanted the device. It was about finding who had directed them to do it. Who had the motivation? Who had the access? Who had the authority to move freely through the ship's medical bay? Who would have the technical knowledge to operate sophisticated surveillance equipment? And then, incredibly, impossibly, the investigation turned toward the highest levels. Captain Marcus Holloway, not the junior doctor who'd run. The other Marcus Holloway, the deputy director of naval intelligence. The evidence was circumstantial at first. Holloway had been at naval stations where other implanted officers had served. Holloway had access to medical personnel through his administrative authority. Holloway had the technical knowledge. He'd spent 15 years in signals intelligence before moving into administration. Holloway had the motivation. Encrypted financial transfers to offshore accounts suggested he was being paid substantial sums by foreign intelligence agencies. "This is impossible," Admiral Hartwell said when the evidence was presented to him. His voice sounded hollow, defeated. "Marcus Holloway is one of the most decorated officers in naval intelligence. I've known him for 20 years. We served together. I would have trusted him with my life." "That's exactly why he was so effective," Walsh said quietly. "He had access and trust that someone younger, less established, couldn't have obtained. He used that access and that trust to compromise multiple officers." The investigation expanded again. Walsh and her team began examining every officer Holloway had worked with, every station where he'd been assigned, every decision he'd influenced. The scope of the conspiracy became apparent. Holloway had implanted devices in at least 7 officers over the past 2 years. All of them had access to classified information. All of them served in positions where their communications could yield valuable intelligence. Sarah felt sick when she realized the implications. She'd been one of many, a resource to be exploited, a vessel for carrying stolen secrets. Her violation wasn't personal, it was systematic, it was professional, it was calculated. But there was one more revelation that changed everything. The investigation into the helicopter crash became part of the broader inquiry. Aeronautics specialists examined the wreckage more carefully, looking for evidence of sabotage. What they found was definitive. The hydraulic system hadn't failed naturally. It had been deliberately damaged. Someone had tampered with the helicopter before Sarah's flight. Someone had wanted her dead. "He was eliminating evidence," Walsh explained to Sarah when she brought her the findings. "Holloway knew you were suspicious. He knew you might figure out what was happening, so he ordered someone to sabotage your helicopter. He was trying to kill you to protect his operation." Did he order the crash?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "We don't know yet," Walsh admitted. "But the evidence suggests he had knowledge of the sabotage. He may not have ordered it directly, but he knew it was going to happen. He was willing to let you die rather than risk exposure." Sarah felt something break inside her. She'd been betrayed by someone she'd trusted. She'd been used. She'd been marked for death. And the only reason she was alive was because the pilot and co-pilot's sacrifice had given her enough time to reach the life raft. The only reason she'd survived 4 days in the ocean was because of her own determination. But she was alive, and she was going to make sure that Holloway paid for what he'd done. Doc Williams found her late that night, sitting alone on the carrier's flight deck, staring out at the dark water. He sat down beside her without speaking, his massive frame a quiet comfort. "He tried to kill me," Sarah said finally, her voice flat. "Yes," Doc agreed. "He did, but he failed. You survived. And now the entire conspiracy is going to unravel." "What happens to me?" Sarah asked. "After all this is over, do I go back to naval intelligence? Do I go back to the same institution that violated me, that tried to kill me?" Doc was quiet for a long moment. "That's up to you," he said finally. "But whatever you decide, I'll support you. We're not done fighting yet, Sarah. Holloway is still out there, and he needs to answer for what he did." Sarah nodded, drawing strength from Doc's presence, from his commitment to justice. She'd survived the ocean's worst assault. She'd survived this too. But the price, she was beginning to understand, would be far higher than any of them had imagined. The arrest came at dawn, executed with military precision. Federal agents and Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, personnel descended on Captain Marcus Holloway's residence in Norfolk, Virginia, with a warrant signed by a federal judge and sealed with the weight of multiple felony charges: espionage, conspiracy, attempted murder, endangerment of military personnel, treason. Holloway was still in his expensive home, a three-story colonial in an upscale neighborhood that screamed success and achievement. He was in his study, working on his laptop when the agents arrived. According to the official report, he didn't resist. He simply looked up, understanding immediately what was happening, and placed his hands behind his back. The evidence accumulated like an avalanche. His offshore bank accounts contained over $4 million in deposits traced back to foreign intelligence agencies, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Russian FSB, Chinese MSS. The money had been flowing in steadily for almost 3 years. Deposits always followed significant intelligence breaches, always corresponded with classified information that had mysteriously appeared in the hands of hostile nations. Encrypted communications on his personal devices revealed the full scope of his betrayal: messages to handlers in multiple countries, discussions of payment, reports on implanted officers and their access to classified information, plans for maintaining operational security, references to assets and sources, dehumanizing language that stripped the officers he'd violated of their humanity. And there were messages about Sarah, explicit, damning messages. Asset Chen represents significant vulnerability. One encrypted message read: "She's suspicious. Recommended immediate termination. Sabotage of transport helicopter approved. Asset will be eliminated, device destroyed, incident blamed on mechanical failure." Another message, sent hours after her rescue: "Termination failed. Asset survived. Recommend immediate evacuation before exposure. Case is compromised." Sarah read these messages in the secure briefing room, her hands trembling with rage and something darker, a bone-deep certainty that Holloway had knowingly, deliberately ordered her death. She hadn't been an officer to him. She'd been an asset, something to be used and then disposed of when it became inconvenient. "He's admitted to everything," Captain Walsh informed her, her voice carrying a strange mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. When confronted with the evidence, he completely broke down. "He's given a full confession, named his handlers, detailed his entire operation." "How many?" Sarah asked quietly. "How many officers did he compromise?" 12, Walsh replied. 12 officers implanted with devices, all of them serving in positions with access to classified intelligence, all of them unknowingly providing foreign intelligence agencies with information they couldn't obtain any other way. The damage assessment is still ongoing, but it's catastrophic. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps received information about our naval deployments. Russian FSB learned about NATO communications protocols. Chinese MSS obtained data on our Pacific Fleet positioning. Sarah felt sick. The scope of Holloway's betrayal extended far beyond her personal violation. He'd compromised national security. He'd potentially cost lives. He'd turned the institution she'd dedicated her life to serving into a weapon against itself. "Why?" she asked. "Why would someone do this? Why would someone with his position, his rank, his access, why would he throw it all away?" Walsh leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Holloway grew up in military families. His father was Navy, his grandfather was Navy, but he always felt overlooked, undervalued. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, but he was passed over for promotions multiple times. Younger officers advanced faster. He resented it. When foreign intelligence agencies approached him 3 years ago, they knew exactly what buttons to push. They offered him recognition, respect, and money. They made him feel valued in a way the Navy never had. So he became a traitor because his feelings were hurt. Sarah's voice was sharp with contempt. "Betrayal is rarely about the institution," Walsh said quietly. "It's about the individual's sense of self-worth." Holloway convinced himself he was the victim. He convinced himself he deserved compensation for his suffering. By the time he realized what he'd become, he was too deep to stop. The psychological evaluation of Holloway revealed a man of genuine brilliance corrupted by resentment and ego. He'd studied military personnel databases, identified officers with access to sensitive information, and methodically recruited junior medical personnel to perform the implants. He'd created a sophisticated operation, compartmentalized information so no one person knew the full scope of his conspiracy, and maintained operational security with the professionalism of someone who'd trained his entire life in intelligence work. But his fundamental flaw was the same as many traitors. He'd underestimated the people he considered beneath him. He'd assumed the junior doctor he'd recruited would never be caught. He'd assumed Sarah would die in the helicopter crash. He'd assumed his sophisticated encryption and careful compartmentalization would protect him indefinitely. He'd been wrong about all of it. The Navy court-martial convened officially 3 weeks later. Sarah was called to testify, and she stood in the witness box with Doc Williams sitting in the gallery behind her, a silent pillar of support. Holloway looked diminished in the defendant's chair, a man whose carefully constructed image of success and competence had collapsed entirely. His brilliant mind, the thing he'd always valued most about himself, was now his greatest liability. The court's psychiatric evaluation detailed his narcissistic personality disorder, his belief that rules didn't apply to him, his conviction that his superior intellect justified his actions. Sarah recounted her survival ordeal, her discovery of the implant, the investigation that had followed. She detailed the moment she'd realized that someone in the Navy, someone in a position of trust and authority, had violated her most fundamentally. She described the horror of understanding that her life had been marked for termination, that she'd been expendable, that the institution she'd served was harboring a traitor. "Did Captain Holloway ever express any inappropriate interest in your work?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Sarah replied. "That was the terrifying part. He was always professional. He was always courteous. He seemed genuinely invested in the intelligence operations I was involved with. But I now understand he was only interested in how he could extract value from the information I had access to." When it came time for Holloway's defense, his lawyer presented arguments about diminished capacity, about the mitigating circumstances of Holloway's personal struggles, about his years of service and his family military history. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Holloway's own confession had sealed his fate. The verdict came back quickly, guilty on all 23 counts. The judge, a stern-faced captain with decades of military service, handed down the sentence with finality that seemed to echo through the courtroom: 60 years in federal prison. Consecutive, not concurrent. A sentence that would extend well beyond Holloway's natural lifespan. As security personnel led Holloway from the courtroom, his eyes met Sarah's for just a moment. There was no remorse there, no acknowledgement of her suffering, no humanity. There was only the cold assessment of a man realizing he'd miscalculated, he'd been outmaneuvered, and he would spend the remainder of his life paying the price. Sarah felt no triumph at his conviction. Instead, she felt a hollow sense that justice, however perfect in form, couldn't undo violation. It couldn't restore what had been taken from her. It couldn't erase the knowledge that someone she'd worked with, someone whose authority she'd respected, had regarded her as nothing more than a means to an end. After the verdict was announced, Admiral Hartwell requested a private meeting with Sarah in his quarters. The admiral looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier, aged by the weight of having failed in his most fundamental responsibility, protecting the officers under his command. "I want to apologize," Hartwell said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "Holloway was on my command staff. I should have seen the signs. I should have known something was wrong. A commanding officer is responsible for his personnel, and I failed you. I failed all of the officers he violated." "With respect, sir," Sarah replied, "you couldn't have known. He was too careful. He compartmentalized too effectively. The signs only became visible after the conspiracy was exposed." "Nevertheless," Hartwell said, I'm implementing sweeping security reforms throughout naval intelligence. We're establishing new protocols for medical personnel vetting. We're creating an independent oversight board to monitor classified information access. We're implementing regular security audits and vulnerability assessments. And we're establishing a new division, the Naval Security Division, to focus specifically on internal threats and espionage prevention. He paused, studying Sarah carefully. "I'd like you to head that division," he said, "assuming you're willing to continue serving in naval intelligence." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. A month ago, the answer would have been automatic. Naval intelligence was her career, her calling, her identity. But now, having experienced profound betrayal from within the institution, she wasn't certain. "Can I have some time to think about it?" she asked. Hartwell nodded. "Of course, take whatever time you need." That evening, Sarah found Doc Williams on the carrier's flight deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and crimson. She sat down beside him without speaking, as he had done for her weeks earlier. "Holloway got 60 years, Sarah said finally. "Justice," Doc replied simply. "Not really," Sarah said. "Justice would mean none of this happened. Justice would mean I never had a device implanted in my body. Justice would mean the officers he violated could get back the time and trust he stole from them. 60 years in prison is just consequence. It's not justice." "No," Doc agreed. "But it's something. It's accountability. And sometimes that's the closest thing to justice we get." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the Persian Gulf in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah thought about the 3 days she'd spent in that raft, fighting for survival, and the 3 weeks she'd spent in investigation, fighting for truth. She thought about Morrison and Kumar, the helicopter crew who died. She thought about Torres, still recovering from his head injury but alive. She thought about the other officers Holloway had violated, and the damage his betrayal would do to their careers and their sense of security. "What are you going to do?" Doc asked, as if reading her thoughts. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I don't know if I can go back to naval intelligence. Every time I see an admiral, every time I walk into a classified briefing, I'll wonder if there's another traitor in the room. I'll wonder if my trust is misplaced again." "That's the real damage," Doc said quietly. "Not the implant, not the sabotage, not even the violation. The real damage is what it does to your ability to trust institutions, to trust people in authority, to believe in the system you've dedicated your life to." "Can that kind of damage heal?" Sarah asked. Doc considered the question carefully. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know that you survived 4 days in an open raft. I know you survived institutional betrayal at the highest levels. I know you have the strength to figure out who you want to be after all of this. And I know that whatever you decide, you'll do it with integrity and purpose. That's the kind of officer you are." Sarah nodded, drawing strength from his words, from his presence, from his commitment to her recovery. Not just physical, but psychological and emotional. The path forward was unclear. But for the first time since the crash, Sarah Chen felt something other than fear or rage or despair. She felt possibility. The Navy's official response to the Holloway scandal was swift and comprehensive. Within days of the conviction, Admiral Hartwell held a press conference acknowledging the security breach and outlining immediate reforms. The message was clear. The Navy took accountability seriously, and measures were being implemented to ensure such a catastrophic breach could never happen again. But accountability extended beyond institutional policy. It required personal reckoning. Sarah attended multiple debriefing sessions with military psychiatrists, all of them attempting to help her process the trauma of her ordeal, not just the 4 days at sea, but the deeper violation of discovering she'd been systematically exploited by someone in a position of trust. The sessions were difficult, emotionally draining, and occasionally revelatory. "The thing about betrayal," Dr. Patricia Morrison explained during one session, is that it damages not just your relationship with the person who betrayed you, but your relationship with the entire system that person represented. You trusted naval intelligence. You trusted your commanding officers. You trusted the institution to protect you. Holloway exploited all of those trusts simultaneously. "How do I rebuild that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Slowly," Morrison replied, "and selectively. You don't rebuild trust in the institution as a whole. You rebuild it in specific people, specific systems, specific processes that have proven themselves trustworthy. And you maintain a healthy skepticism about authority, because that skepticism prevents you from becoming naive again." Torres had recovered remarkably well from his head injury. The concussion had been severe but not catastrophic. Within 3 weeks he was cleared for duty, though he remained shaken by the experience. Sarah visited him regularly in the medical bay, and they talked about their shared ordeal, the horror of the crash, the desperation of survival, the discovery that had transformed their rescue into something far more sinister. "I keep thinking about Morrison and Kumar," Torres said during one visit. "They were just trying to do their jobs. They died because Holloway wanted to cover his tracks. That doesn't feel like justice to me." "It's not justice," Sarah agreed. "It's consequence without meaning, which is maybe why it's so hard to accept." Doc Williams had become an unexpected fixture in Sarah's life. He remained on the carrier for 2 additional weeks beyond his normal rotation, ostensibly for follow-up medical assessments, but actually to support Sarah's recovery. He attended her therapy sessions with her permission. He sat with her during the difficult moments when the reality of what had happened overwhelmed her coping mechanisms. He was, she realized, becoming something more than a rescuer. He was becoming a friend. "Why are you still here?" she asked him one evening as they sat in the carrier's small library, both pretending to read. "Because you need support," Doc replied simply. "And because what happened to you matters to me. You're not just another survivor I pulled out of the water. You're a person who was violated by the system you trusted, and I want to be part of ensuring you don't lose faith in humanity entirely." "What if I have?" Sarah asked quietly. "What if I've already lost faith?" "Then I'll help you find it again," Doc said. "That's what we do in the teams. We never leave anyone behind, not physically and not emotionally either." The investigation into other implanted officers revealed a similar pattern of exploitation and violation. Each of the 12 officers had been unaware of the device in their body. Each had discovered it only after Sarah's rescue triggered the broader investigation. Each was now dealing with the same psychological fallout, the same sense of betrayal, the same struggle to rebuild trust in institutions and authority figures. Admiral Hartwell established a support program for the affected officers: mandatory counseling, legal representation, medical follow-up, and career counseling. It was an acknowledgement that the damage extended far beyond the initial violation, encompassing trust, confidence, and professional identity. But for Sarah, the path forward became clearer when Hartwell made his formal offer of the Naval Security Division position. She requested a meeting with him in his office, a private space where she could speak freely. "I want to accept the position," she told him, "but with conditions." Hartwell leaned back in his chair, regarding her with respect. "Name them." "First, I want complete autonomy in hearing and staffing. No one goes into that division unless I personally vet them and believe they have integrity beyond reproach. Second, I want direct reporting to you, not through the normal chain of command. I want to maintain independence and avoid being compromised by other departmental interests. Third, I want my findings to be presented directly to the Joint Chiefs if necessary. If I discover internal threats, I need the authority to escalate without obstruction." Hartwell nodded slowly. "Those are significant demands." "They're non-negotiable," Sarah replied. "Because if I'm going to dedicate my career to preventing another Holloway situation, I need to operate with the autonomy to do so effectively. Compromises in authority create vulnerabilities. I won't accept those vulnerabilities." "Agreed," Hartwell said. "On one additional condition, you coordinate with NCIS and other federal agencies. This can't be a purely naval operation. We need interagency cooperation." "Agreed," Sarah said. "But NCIS doesn't have veto power over my recommendations." "Understood," Hartwell confirmed. The position was officially established in Sarah's name. Commander Sarah Chen, Director of Naval Security Division. The division's mandate was broad: identify internal threats to national security, investigate potential espionage, review and update security protocols, and maintain constant vigilance against the kind of systematic betrayal that Holloway had orchestrated. It was work that would define the remainder of her military career. The court-martial of the junior doctor who'd actually performed the implants was considerably less dramatic than Holloway's. The young captain, Dr. Michael Brennan, broke down completely when confronted with evidence of his involvement. He'd been recruited by Holloway, offered substantial payment, and promised that the medical procedure would be minimally invasive and that the officers implanted would never discover the device or suffer permanent harm. "I was stupid," Brennan told the court, his voice hollow with regret. "I wanted to believe I was doing something noble, something that would help gather intelligence to protect American interests. But I knew, deep down, that what I was doing was wrong. I violated the oath I took as a physician. I violated the trust these officers placed in me. I can't undo any of that." Brennan received 15 years in federal prison, substantially less than Holloway because he was viewed as a tool rather than an architect. But the sentence carried the weight of professional ruin. His medical license was permanently revoked. His career was destroyed. His future was forfeit. Sarah attended the sentencing but felt no satisfaction at the outcome. Brennan had been manipulated by Holloway, exploited just as she had been, though in different ways. His guilt was real. His responsibility was genuine, but he was ultimately a victim of Holloway's exploitation as well. 3 weeks after Holloway's conviction, Sarah stood before the assembled officers of Naval Intelligence to deliver her first speech as director of the Security Division. The auditorium was packed. Everyone wanted to see the officer who'd survived the helicopter crash, exposed the conspiracy, and been elevated to a position of significant authority despite her relatively junior rank. Sarah approached the podium, her uniform pristine, her bearing ramrod straight despite the nervous energy coursing through her body. "3 weeks ago," she began, her voice steady and clear, "a man who held a position of significant authority in this institution betrayed every oath he'd taken, every principle he'd claimed to represent, and every officer he'd worked with. Captain Marcus Holloway violated the trust that is the foundation of military service. He exploited our colleagues. He compromised our national security. He attempted to murder an officer to cover his crimes." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "We want to believe that this is an isolated incident. We want to believe that institutions are inherently trustworthy, that authority figures are by definition reliable. But Holloway's betrayal reminds us that institutions are only as trustworthy as the individuals who comprise them. No amount of policy, no amount of oversight, no amount of security protocols can fully protect against someone with the knowledge, position, and motivation to exploit the system." She shifted her stance slightly, her eyes scanning the room. "So we must do 3 things. First, we must implement the security reforms already underway, the vetting procedures, the oversight mechanisms, the audit processes. These are necessary but insufficient. Second, we must create a culture where officers feel empowered to report suspicious activity without fear of retaliation. Third, and most importantly, we must maintain healthy skepticism about authority while preserving faith in the institution's fundamental purpose: to protect the nation and the people who serve it." Sarah looked directly at the assembly. "The Naval Security Division exists to identify threats before they become catastrophic. We will be investigating personnel, reviewing procedures, and maintaining constant vigilance. We will not always be popular. We will sometimes find things that senior officers would prefer remain hidden. But we will do this work because trust, once broken, must be painstakingly rebuilt, and because the officers of naval intelligence deserve to serve in an institution worthy of their sacrifice. The room erupted in applause. Some officers were enthusiastically supportive. Others applauded more slowly, recognizing that Sarah's division would inevitably scrutinize them as well. That evening, Doc Williams found Sarah on the flight deck again, watching the sunset as had become their routine. "You were incredible up there," he said, sitting beside her. "I was terrified," Sarah replied. "I'm still terrified. Do you know how many people I'm going to disappoint? How many officers are going to resent my division? How many people are going to see me as a threat rather than a protector?" "Probably most of them," Doc said honestly. "But you're not doing this to be popular. You're doing this because it matters. You're doing this because the system failed you, and you're determined to ensure it doesn't fail others the same way." Sarah nodded, watching the light fade from the sky. "How did this become my life? A month ago, I was a mid-level intelligence officer managing classified information. Now I'm a division director investigating admirals." "Because you survived," Doc said simply, "and because survival demands purpose. You survived the ocean. You survived institutional betrayal. Now you're going to use that survival to protect others from the same fate." "Do you really believe that?" Sarah asked. "I know it," Doc replied. "I've seen it happen with the men I've served with. Trauma either breaks you or strengthens you. You've chosen to be strengthened. That's rarer than you might think." Over the following months, Sarah's Naval Security Division became operational. She recruited carefully officers with integrity, intelligence specialists with keen observational skills, investigators with experience in internal affairs and counterintelligence. She established protocols for receiving and investigating reports of suspicious activity. She began the painstaking work of reviewing personnel files, communications patterns, and financial transactions. The division would eventually uncover 3 additional cases of unauthorized financial activities, 2 instances of personnel with undisclosed foreign contacts, and 1 instance of a junior officer with concerning ties to extremist groups. None of them rose to the level of Holloway's conspiracy, but each represented a potential vulnerability that, if unaddressed, could have metastasized into something far more serious. Sarah's work was vindicated. The Navy recognized the Security Division's value and expanded its mandate across all naval intelligence operations. Sarah's name became synonymous with rigorous internal oversight and uncompromising commitment to security. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah Chen had transformed her personal trauma into institutional protection. She'd taken the violation done to her and converted it into vigilance that protected others. She'd taken the betrayal she'd experienced and turned it into mechanisms that prevented similar betrayals. It wasn't the same as justice, but it was something approaching redemption. 6 months after Holloway's conviction, the Navy held a formal awards ceremony in the Pentagon's Grand Hall. Officers in dress uniforms filled the space, admirals, captains, commanders, all gathered to witness the recognition of exceptional service and sacrifice. Sarah stood backstage in her dress blues, her uniform perfectly pressed, her medals arrayed on her chest in the order of precedence. She'd received medals before: a Navy Commendation Medal for her intelligence work, a National Defense Service Medal for her deployment, but nothing like what was about to happen. Admiral Hartwell appeared beside her, his weathered face carrying a mixture of pride and something deeper, perhaps a sense of karmic balance, of ensuring that the officer whose life he'd failed to protect was being recognized for the remarkable strength she demonstrated in the aftermath. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." The ceremony itself was formal and structured. a succession of awards presented to officers for various service achievements. But when Sarah's name was called, the atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. Officers sat forward. Attention focused sharply. Everyone understood the significance of what was about to be acknowledged. Admiral Hartwell stood at the podium, reading from prepared remarks that had been carefully drafted and reviewed by multiple Navy public affairs officers. Commander Sarah Chen distinguished herself through extraordinary courage in survival and extraordinary service to the nation in the face of institutional betrayal at the highest levels. Hartwell began, his voice carrying through the amphitheater with practiced authority. Following a helicopter crash in the Persian Gulf, Commander Chen survived 4 days in an open raft through sheer determination, disciplined resource management, and unwavering commitment to naval protocols. During her rescue and subsequent investigation, she was discovered to be the target of an elaborate espionage operation orchestrated by a senior naval intelligence officer. Sarah stood motionless, her face neutral, her hands at her sides, the posture of military respect. Rather than allowing this violation to diminish her faith in the institution she serves, Commander Chen cooperated fully with the investigation, provided critical testimony in the subsequent court-martial, and accepted the challenging assignment to lead the newly established Naval Security Division. Through her work, she has already prevented multiple potential security breaches and established protocols that have become models for interagency security cooperation. Hartwell paused, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the distance. For exceptional courage, unwavering integrity, and extraordinary service to the United States Navy and the nation, it is my honor to present the Navy Medal of Valor to Commander Sarah Chen. The room erupted in applause. Sarah walked forward in the formal military manner, measured steps, precise bearing, the discipline of a career officer on display. Hartwell placed the medal around her neck with careful hands, and for just a moment, his expression softened. She saw something in his face, gratitude perhaps, or recognition that she'd transformed the tragedy of her experience into something that would protect others. When she turned to face the audience, Sarah saw Doc Williams sitting in the third row, his massive frame contained in dress whites, his expression carrying unmistakable pride. He nodded slightly, a gesture that meant more to her than any of the applause thundering through the hall. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Sarah stood in dress uniform, accepting congratulations from officers she'd served with, admirals she'd never met, and various dignitaries who seemed to view her as a symbol of resilience in the face of institutional failure. But the moment she could escape, she found Doc waiting for her outside the reception hall. "That was well-deserved," he said simply. "I was just doing my job," Sarah replied. "No," Doc said. "Your job was to survive and recover. Everything since then, the testimony, the investigation cooperation, the security division leadership, that was you going above and beyond. That was you choosing to transform your trauma into purpose. Not everyone makes that choice." They walked through the Pentagon's corridors in companionable silence, eventually finding themselves on an outdoor terrace overlooking Arlington. The view stretched across the Potomac toward Washington, the monuments and government buildings standing as symbols of the institution Sarah had recommitted her life to serving. "I've been thinking about staying in the Navy," Sarah said quietly, "continuing to lead the security division, building on what we've started, but part of me still struggles with whether I can truly trust this institution again." "Trust isn't binary," Doc replied. "It's not all or nothing. You can trust the Navy's fundamental purpose, to protect the nation while maintaining healthy skepticism about specific individuals and structures. You can commit to serving while remaining vigilant. That's not distrust. That's wisdom." "Is that what you've learned in the teams?" Sarah asked. "That's what you've taught me," Doc said. "Because you didn't break, you didn't run. You didn't allow one person's betrayal to poison your faith in the entire institution. You stayed. You fought. You demanded accountability and worked to prevent recurrence. That's the definition of institutional integrity, not the absence of betrayal, but the commitment to address it when it occurs. Over the following months, Sarah's life settled into a new equilibrium. The Naval Security Division expanded dramatically, establishing satellite offices at major naval installations worldwide. She traveled extensively, implementing security protocols, training personnel, and maintaining constant vigilance against potential internal threats. But perhaps more importantly, she began to heal in ways that no therapy session could have accomplished. Purpose became her medicine. The knowledge that her work was preventing future violations, protecting future officers from the betrayal she'd experienced, gave her trauma meaning. She received letters from other implanted officers whose lives had been violated by Holloway's conspiracy. Some expressed gratitude for her leadership in ensuring accountability. Others simply shared their own struggles with trust and recovery. Sarah read each letter carefully and responded personally, understanding that her visible survival and continued service provided a kind of permission for others to survive as well. One letter came from a Navy nurse who'd been implanted without her knowledge during a routine physical examination. "Thank you for showing us that this violation doesn't have to define us," the nurse wrote. "Your strength has given me strength." Another came from a signals intelligence officer who'd gone into a depressive spiral after discovering the implant. "I was ready to resign," he wrote, "but seeing you refuse to let this destroy your career, that gave me the courage to stay and fight. The Navy is better because you're leading the security division." Sarah kept these letters in a file on her desk. When doubt crept in, when she questioned whether her work truly mattered, whether she was making a genuine difference, she read the letters and was reminded of why she'd chosen to stay. A year after the awards ceremony, Sarah stood on the USS Vanguard's flight deck one final time. She'd requested transfer to Naval Security Division headquarters at the Pentagon, and this was her final day aboard the carrier that had been her home for 2 years. Doc Williams was there to see her off. His rotation with SEAL Team 6 had ended, and he'd returned to Virginia to be with his family, but he'd requested temporary leave to witness Sarah's departure. "You came back," Sarah said, embracing him with genuine affection, something unthinkable a year earlier when she'd been too broken to accept comfort from anyone. "Of course I did," Doc replied. "Couldn't let you leave without properly saying goodbye. We've been through too much together to do this halfway." They stood at the rail, looking out at the Persian Gulf one final time. The water that had nearly killed Sarah shimmered in the afternoon sun, beautiful and indifferent, unchanged by the human drama that had unfolded on its surface. "Are you at peace with what happened?" Doc asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I'm at peace with what I've made of what happened," she said finally. "The crash still haunts me. The violation still stings. The knowledge that Holloway tried to kill me still creates dark moments. But I've transformed those experiences into work that protects others. That provides a kind of closure that justice alone couldn't." "That's as close to peace as most of us get," Doc observed. As Sarah's helicopter lifted off from the flight deck, heading toward the Naval Security Division headquarters and the next chapter of her life, she looked down at the carrier becoming smaller below her. She thought about Morrison and Kumar, the crew members who died in the crash. She thought about Torres, who'd returned to his family and left the Navy. She thought about the 12 officers Holloway had violated, each processing their own trauma, building their own paths forward. And she thought about the young officers who would never experience the violation she'd endured, because she and others like her had worked to prevent it. The Naval Security Division flourished under Sarah's leadership. She recruited the best security minds in the military, established protocols that became standard across all defense intelligence agencies, and created a culture where integrity and accountability were non-negotiable. The division prevented dozens of security breaches, identified multiple personnel with problematic foreign contacts, and maintained constant vigilance against the kind of systematic betrayal that Holloway had perpetrated. Her tenure as director earned her promotion to captain, a rank that typically took officers until their mid-40s to achieve. Sarah made captain at 35, a recognition of both her exceptional competence and the significance of her work. But perhaps her greatest achievement wasn't measured in rank or recognition. It was measured in the officers who came forward with security concerns because they trusted Sarah's division to handle them fairly. It was measured in the military personnel who maintained faith in their institution's ability to police itself, knowing that mechanisms existed to prevent institutional predation. It was measured in the future officers who would never suffer the violation that Sarah had endured, because she'd transformed her trauma into institutional protection. 5 years after the Holloway investigation, Sarah was invited to speak at the Naval Academy, addressing the graduating class. She stood before 1,100 newly commissioned ensigns, the future of the Navy, and told them her story. Not the sanitized version, but the real version. The crash, the desperation, the violation, the betrayal, the struggle to rebuild trust. "The Navy will test you in ways you can't anticipate," she told them. "You'll experience institutional failures. You'll encounter individuals who abuse the power entrusted to them. You'll sometimes question whether an institution as flawed as ours deserves your loyalty. But I'm here to tell you that institutional loyalty isn't about blindly trusting authority. It's about committing to the institution's fundamental purpose while maintaining the vigilance required to prevent its corruption. You are the future of this Navy. Make it worthy of the trust we place in you." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. As Sarah walked off the stage, she saw the faces of the young ensigns, hopeful, determined, ready to serve. She thought about what her journey had cost her, what it had taught her, what it had enabled her to accomplish. The trauma would never fully disappear. The nightmares would occasionally return. The hypervigilance would remain part of her baseline psychology. But these scars had become the foundation of her purpose, the source of her strength, the wellspring from which she drew her commitment to service. That evening, Sarah stood alone in her apartment in Arlington, watching the Potomac River flow past with the constancy of institutional change, endless, inevitable, carrying away the old while bringing in the new. She thought about the woman she'd been before the crash, ambitious, confident, naive about the institution she served. And she thought about the woman she'd become, still ambitious, still confident, but tempered by the knowledge that institutions are only as trustworthy as their members, that authority must be questioned, that vigilance is the price of integrity. Her phone buzzed. A text from Doc Williams. "Saw the video of your speech. You were magnificent, proud of you, Chen." Sarah smiled, typing a response. "Couldn't have done any of this without you. Thank you for staying." The response came back almost immediately. "Always. We take care of our own." Sarah looked out at the river one final time before turning away from the window. Her life had been irrevocably changed by 4 days in an open raft and the conspiracy that had attempted to end it. But she'd refused to be broken. She'd refused to allow her trauma to become an excuse for inaction. She transformed her survival into purpose, her violation into vigilance, her betrayal into a commitment to institutional integrity. She was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen no longer. She was Captain Sarah Chen, Director of Naval Security Division, architect of protocols that would protect generations of naval personnel from internal threats and institutional predation. She was a phoenix that had risen from the ashes of betrayal, burned bright with the fire of her survival, and emerged transformed into something stronger, fiercer, more resolute than she'd ever been. And her story, the story of a woman who'd been broken by her institution and had chosen to rebuild both herself and that institution, would ripple through the Navy for decades to come, inspiring officers to question authority, to report threats, to maintain the vigilance required to prevent another Holloway. In the end, Sarah Chen's greatest victory wasn't her survival or her promotion or the medals on her chest. It was the knowledge that her trauma, her violation, her pain had been transformed into a shield that would protect countless others from experiencing the same. That was true redemption. That was true purpose. That was a life that mattered.